Welcome to Fog Street Mysteries, where every story begins in shadows and every clue glows under a single street lamp. If you love fog-soaked alleys, tense interrogations, and the electric thrill of unraveling a mystery, you're in the right place. Step inside, the next case is already waiting. Don't forget to share thoughts. Your feedback keeps the mystery alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, The Prodigy Plays His Last Note. If you ever want proof that genius is a nuisance, don't ask a philosopher, ask the people who have to sit in the same room with it. I was wedged into a red velvet chair on the east side of Manhattan, watching Elliot Crane make a piano behave like it had been born knowing better. He was 22, thin as a tax excuse, and dressed like he'd just lost a bet with a tailor. The audience leaned forward as if gravity had been adjusted to favor the stage. Crane didn't notice. He never did. The piano was his world, and the rest of us were furniture. He finished with a flourish that wasn't flashy but exact, like a signature written with confidence instead of ink. There was a half-second of silence, always the best compliment, then applause that could have knocked plaster loose. Crane stood, nodded once, and sat back down as if applause were a mild inconvenience. That was the last thing he did alive. He didn't slump dramatically or clutch his chest. He simply stopped. One moment his fingers were hovering above the keys, the next they were resting there like they'd decided to retire. His face went gray, then oddly calm, and he slid sideways onto the bench. Someone screamed. Someone else shouted for a doctor. I stood up, because that's what I do when the universe clears its throat. By the time they got him to the floor, he was gone. The newspapers had their answer by morning. Exhaustion. Weak heart. Tragic genius burns too bright. They love that stuff. It saves ink. But I don't read the papers for answers, I read them for mistakes. And this one smelled wrong enough to follow me home. I was back at the brownstone by 11 the next morning, nursing a cup of coffee and regretting last night's late pastrami when the doorbell rang. Fritz was in the kitchen conducting one of his small, holy wars with a sauce, and Nero Wolfe was in his red leather armchair, occupying it the way other men occupy countries. Archie, Wolfe said without looking at me, you are frowning. I do that when music critics cry, I said. Or when dead prodigies fall over on stage. That got his eyes up. Wolfe's eyes don't move often, but when they do, something's about to lose an argument. The visitor was a tall man with careful manners and a face that had learned restraint the hard way. He introduced himself as Martin Hale, former teacher and current ex-something to Elliot Crane. He held his hat like it might confess if squeezed. I don't believe it was natural, Hale said. Wolfe folded his fingers on his stomach. Belief is inexpensive. Facts are not. Hale swallowed. Elliot was difficult. But he was not ill. He was obsessed with control. Diet, sleep, timing, everything. He would never have risked a performance if his health were uncertain. That was my first quiet click of interest. Control is a dangerous word around Wolfe. He respects it the way a cat respects a vacuum cleaner, warily. Wolfe asked questions the way surgeons use scalpels, precise, minimal, and with no interest in reassurance. Hale answered carefully. Too carefully. When Wolfe finally dismissed him, Hale looked relieved and disappointed at the same time. Wolfe turned to me. Mr. Crane died at a moment of culmination. That is seldom accidental. You're saying murder, I said. I am saying improbability. That was enough to cancel my afternoon plans. By dinner Wolfe was in a temper, which Fritz noticed immediately and responded to by improving the soup. Wolfe ate in silence, drank his beer with more emphasis than usual, and retreated to the orchids as if they might offer counsel. When he came back, he announced, Archie, you will investigate the prodigy. Any particular angle? Yes. His habits. His associates. And what he consumed last night. I grabbed my hat. Anything else? Do not be obvious. I hate that instruction. It's like telling a pianist not to touch the keys. Crane's apartment was a minimalist shrine to ego, white walls, expensive silence, and furniture that looked uncomfortable on purpose. His assistant, Lena Voss, answered the door. Efficient, sharp, and brittle. The kind of woman who keeps schedules the way other people keep secrets. Mr. Crane collapsed, she said before I asked. The doctor said. I know what they said, I told her. I want to know what he drank. She blinked. Just once. Water. Mineral. Only water. Yes. That was click number 2. No one drinks only water after a performance unless they're hiding from something. At the recital hall, the stage manager remembered everything except what mattered. Except the beverage. Except who brought it. Except whether anyone else touched it. Memory is a cooperative witness until it isn't. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was settled in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who had found the right question and was waiting for the answer to catch up. You are late, he said. I was being unobvious. And? Crane was obsessive about control. Drank one thing. Trusted very few people. Made enemies with talent and enthusiasm. Wolfe nodded. A prodigy poisons himself only if he is careless or arrogant. He was both. Then someone exploited it. The phone rang. Late calls never bring good news, they bring confirmation. The medical examiner had amended the report. Nothing conclusive. One minor irregularity. Nothing worth headlines. Wolfe smiled thinly. There it is. There's what? The pause between notes, Wolfe said. The space where murder hides. I looked at the orchids glowing softly behind him, at the beer glass on the table, at the red leather chair that had held more secrets than most vaults. Looks like the prodigy didn't play solo after all, I said. No, Wolfe replied. He had an accompanist. And somewhere in New York, someone who understood genius very well was hoping we wouldn't hear the rest of the music. Chapter 2, A Talent That Made Enemies. If a man dies and leaves behind nothing but sorrow, he was either a saint or a doormat. Elliot Crane was neither. He left behind grief, sure, but also a neat stack of resentments, some of them stamped and notarized. The morning after Wolfe decided the universe had slipped a wrong note into the score, he treated routine like a religion. He spent the early hours with the orchids, and if you think that's a peaceful hobby, you've never seen a man glare at a flower for failing to bloom on schedule. Fritz served breakfast as if it were a diplomatic summit, and Wolfe consumed it with solemn gratitude and zero small talk. I waited until he had finished his second cup of coffee and the air around him stopped crackling. Well? I said. Wolfe's eyes moved to me with the slow weight of a safe door swinging shut. You will continue. Continue what? I already learned Crane drank mineral water and believed in control. You learned, Wolfe corrected, that an assistant claimed he drank mineral water. That is not the same. He took a folded paper from the table beside him, neatly arranged, of course. Wolfe's papers are always neat. The world may be chaos, but his desk refuses to participate. I telephoned a contact at the recital hall, he said. A waiter recalls serving Mr. Crane a glass of water himself. Yet another staff member insists the glass was already on the side table before the performance began. Contradiction, I said. Possibility. Possibility of what? Wolfe's lips twitched, which is as close as he comes to a grin without a legal reason. Possibility of preparation. That was enough to put my hat back on my head. The rival who lost his name. My first stop was a small office near Broadway where a man named Julian Krebs wrote music for commercials and nursed old wounds like they paid rent. He was Elliot Crane's rival composer in the same way a street boxer is a rival to a champion, technically, yes, but not in the champion's mind. Krebs opened the door with a scowl that looked practiced. The room smelled like stale coffee and desperation. You Archie Goodwin, he said. Wolfe's man. You're quick. Crane ever accuse you of stealing that too? He flinched. Good. Flinches are honest. Krebs leaned on the desk. Crane ruined me. He went on the radio and implied I plagiarized him. Me. As if he invented melody. Did you? I asked. Of course not. People who say, of course, like that usually mean, maybe, technically. Where were you last night? I asked. At home, he snapped. Alone. Like always. Convenient. It's true. He shoved open a drawer and produced a crumpled program from the recital. I didn't even go. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I took it. There was a faint crease down the middle. Someone had held it, folded it, maybe checked it for timing. Maybe in the hull. Maybe not. It wasn't proof of anything, just a little paper whispering to be remembered. As I left, Krebs called after me, ask who paid for him. Ask who owned him. He wasn't a genius, Goodwin. He was a product. Products have manufacturers. Wolfe would like that. The patron who held the strings. The next manufacturer was Mrs. Cordelia Rusk, patroness of the arts and ruler of a penthouse that smelled like money pretending to be perfume. She received me in a sitting room where the chairs looked like they'd never been sat in without permission. Mrs. Rusk was 60-ish, wrapped in elegance, with eyes too sharp for comfort. I adored Eliot, she said. He had fire. Fire burns, I reminded her. She smiled politely. You're Wolfe's man. I expected more height. I'm the portable model, I said. Tell me about your contract with Crane. Her mouth tightened, just enough. It was not a contract. It was an arrangement. That's what people call contracts when they don't want them read aloud. She stood, gliding to a shelf and touching a small gold-framed photograph, Crane at the piano, her hand resting on his shoulder like a claim. He was difficult, she said softly. But I protected him. I provided opportunities. The best halls. The best instruments. And in exchange, a percentage. And loyalty. Did he give you loyalty? Her eyes cooled. Eliot was exploring independence. Translation, he was slipping the leash. Any reason to believe he was ill? I asked. None. Any reason to believe someone wanted him dead? She turned back to me. Many. Name one. She paused a fraction too long. His mentor. Martin Hale. That was interesting. Hale had been the first to come to Wolfe, playing the distressed teacher. Either he was sincere, or he was the sort who lights fires and calls the brigade. The jealous prodigy. After Mrs. Rusk, I headed to a rehearsal studio in Midtown that had seen more sweat than applause. There I met Sylvia Merrick, 23, another pianist billed in small print under Crane's big letters. She was all angles and intensity, with hands that flexed when she spoke. Her eyes snapped to me like a metronome. Crane is dead, she said flatly. So now we all pretend he was a saint. Not me, I said. I'm allergic to saints. How did you feel about him? He was brilliant, she admitted, and there was poison in the word. He was also cruel. He'd listen to you play and point out your flaws like he was doing you a favor. Did he do you a favor recently? Her jaw tightened. He was going to block my European tour. He told Rusk I wasn't ready. And were you? She stared at me, and for a second I saw something raw. Yes. That yes had heat. But heat isn't proof. Where were you during the recital? I asked. In the audience. Row G. Anyone confirm? Plenty. Anyone who likes you? She snorted. This business isn't built on liking. As I left, she said, almost casually, if you're hunting poison, look at the people who fed him. Crane didn't trust strangers. He trusted routines. There was that word again. Routines. Wolfe's favorite weapon. The assistant who touched everything. Back to Crane's apartment building. I caught Lena Voss coming out with a folder tucked under her arm like a shield. "Miss Voss," I said. "Mind if we talk again?" Her face went blank, professionally blank. "I've said all I can." "That's never true," I told her. "You said he drank only mineral water. But the hall staff disagree about when and how it was served." She hesitated. A tiny hesitation. Then she said, "Elliot insisted on a specific brand. I brought it." "From where?" "From his kitchen. He prepared for performances the same way every time." "Prepared how?" She swallowed. "He would rinse the glass. He believed tap water spoiled taste." "And last night?" Her eyes flickered away. "Last night was hectic." "Meaning you didn't see him rinse the glass?" "I didn't say that." "No," I said. "You didn't. That's what makes it interesting." I followed her to a small diner on the corner, one of those places where the coffee is hot, the booths are cracked, and everyone minds their business loudly. She slid into a booth, and I slid in opposite. We looked like a bad date and a worse idea. "Tell me something true," I said. She stared at the sugar dispenser like it was giving her instructions. Elliot had been frightened. That made my spine straighten. "Frightened of what?" "He said someone had found a way to touch him without being near him." "That's poetic," I said. "Did he name anyone?" "No. He didn't trust names. He trusted systems." "What systems?" She shook her head. "His schedule. His diet. His assistant." She looked up then, and her eyes were suddenly human. Me. There it was, guilt or fear, maybe both. Who had access to his food and drink? I asked. I did. The caterers sometimes. Mrs. Rusk's staff for events. Martin Hale, he came by 2 days ago with a bottle of something restorative. Elliot refused it. A restorative bottle. Hale again. I paid for the coffee because I'm a gentleman when it helps. Outside, New York had that winter gray look, taxis slashing through wet streets, people moving like they had someplace safer to be. Wolfe listens, then speaks. Back at the brownstone, the smell of orchids met me on the stairs like a quiet accusation. Wolfe was in his chair, beer at hand, as if he'd never moved, which was usually accurate. I gave him the highlights: Krebs' bitterness, Mrs. Rusk's control, Marek's jealousy, Voss's slips, and Hale's restorative bottle. Wolfe's eyes narrowed slightly. Mr. Hale neglected to mention a bottle. Maybe it wasn't important. To him, Wolfe said, or to you. I opened my mouth and shut it again. Wolfe was annoyingly good at that. He tapped a finger on the arm of his chair. We have a constellation of motives: envy, profit, revenge, fear. That is common. The uncommon element is method. Mr. Crane was not merely famous, he was disciplined. To poison such a man, one must penetrate discipline. So we look for someone who knew his routines, I said. Wolfe nodded once. And someone who benefited from his death. That's half of New York, I muttered. Then, Wolfe said, calm as a judge pronouncing sentence, we shall begin narrowing New York. The phone rang again, late afternoon, which meant trouble was keeping decent hours. I answered. A voice from the medical examiner's office, hesitant and cautious, asked if I was connected to Nero Wolfe. I said yes, and the voice got quieter. They found something, the man said. A trace. Not enough to say publicly. But enough to be concerned. I looked at Wolfe. He was watching me like he already knew what the voice would say. When I hung up, Wolfe said, now, Archie, we will require the guests to come to us, before they begin destroying their own evidence. Outside, traffic hissed on the wet street. Inside, the orchids glowed like pale witnesses. And somewhere in the city, someone who understood routines was probably realizing that Nero Wolfe had heard the wrong note, and intended to make the whole orchestra replay it. Chapter 3, Music, Timing, and Motive. If timing is everything, then murder is just bad music played by someone with a good ear. Nero Wolfe spent the morning with his orchids, which meant I spent it not annoying him. That's a delicate balance, like standing still on a moving sidewalk. When he finally emerged from the plant room, the air around him carried that faint, green smell that always reminded me of secrets growing in silence. "Archie," he said, lowering himself into the red leather chair with the gravity of a judge taking the bench, "bring me the recital program." I handed it over. He studied it as if it were a confession written in invisible ink. "Observe," he said, tapping a thick finger on the page. "The order. The duration. The intermission." "You're telling me music has alibis," I said. "Music," Wolfe replied, "has structure. Murder prefers structure. Chaos is inefficient." He dictated while I took notes, which is our version of harmony. He wanted exact timings, when Crane walked on stage, when he paused, when he drank, when he collapsed. He wanted to know how long applause lasted, how long the pianist sat alone before beginning the final piece, and who was near him during those minutes. "You want me to replay the evening," I said. "I want you," Wolfe corrected, "to listen." So I did. Backstage mathematics. The recital hall looked different in daylight, less glamorous, more honest. The stage manager, a thin man with a stopwatch personality, let me poke around backstage while sighing professionally. Crane was punctual, he said. Always. He hated improvisation unless it was musical. Who brought his water? I asked. That's the thing, the man said, rubbing his forehead. Usually, his assistant. But last night. Yes. I prompted. There was confusion. Someone had already placed the glass. Lena thought staff had done it. Staff thought Lena had. And nobody checked. He shook his head. Crane didn't like fuss. That was contradiction number 1, wrapped in habit. A glass that appeared without an owner. I stood where Crane had stood, imagined the lights, the applause, the heat. A pianist doesn't gulp water. He sips. One sip could be enough, if you knew what you were doing. Anyone else near the piano? I asked. A tuner earlier. Cleaning crew before that. Mrs. Rusk's people for flowers. Flowers. I made a note. Wolfe liked lists. A doctor with reservations. The medical examiner's office was all white walls and restrained voices. The doctor I spoke to looked like a man who'd learned not to speculate out loud. We found traces, he said carefully. Nothing definitive. Something that shouldn't be there. Poison, I said. He shrugged. A substance consistent with acceleration. It speeds certain bodily responses. In small doses, harmless. In precise timing, dangerous. Dangerous how? He glanced at the door. It could mimic collapse from stress. Heart failure. Particularly in someone who had just exerted himself. Like playing the piano for 2 hours, I said. Exactly. That was contradiction number 2. A man in perfect health dying like one who wasn't. Could it be administered orally? I asked. Yes. Quickly absorbed. In a sip. He didn't smile. Wolfe hears the rhythm. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, fingers steepled. Fritz moved quietly in the background, as if the house itself knew better than to interrupt. When I finished, Wolfe opened his eyes. The poison, he said, is not the point. That's funny, I said. Most murderers think it is. The poison, Wolfe continued, ignoring me, is an instrument. The timing is the melody. He reached for his beer, took a sip, and set it down with deliberate care. Mr. Crane collapsed at the precise moment of transition, from performance to rest. The body, like the mind, is vulnerable during transitions. You're saying whoever did this waited for the curtain call, I said. Precisely. Applause elevates adrenaline. A pause allows it to drop. Add an accelerant, and the descent becomes fatal. I stared at him. You ever think about switching careers? Maybe teaching music? Do not be frivolous, Wolfe said. Now, who would know this? That was the question, wasn't it? Knowledge as motive. I went back through my mental Rolodex of suspects. Krebs knew music, sure, but his bitterness was blunt, not precise. Mrs. Rusk knew control and schedules, but not physiology. Sylvia Merrick knew performance stress, she lived inside it. Lena Voss knew every routine down to the minute. And Martin Hale, the mentor, had spent years shaping Crane's habits. Knowledge wasn't motive, but it narrowed the field. The phone rang just before dinner, which annoyed Wolfe and therefore delighted me. Archie Goodwin, I said. A woman's voice, tight, controlled. Sylvia Merrick. They're saying Crane was poisoned, she said. Who's they? People who listen. What do you want, Sylvia? She hesitated. That made my ears perk up. I want you to know. Crane altered the program last minute. That was new. How? He extended the final piece. Added an unscheduled reprise. He did it to show off. Did anyone know? Only those backstage. And me. He told me during intermission. Why tell you? Her laugh was sharp. Because he enjoyed reminding me he could. I wrote it down. An altered timeline meant someone had to adjust, or anticipate. When I told Wolfe over dinner, he paused mid-bite. Fritz froze. Unscheduled, Wolfe said softly. Yet the death occurred not during, but after. So the poison wasn't timed to the music, I said. It was timed to Crane. Exactly, Wolfe said. Which implies observation, or certainty. The beverage revisited. After dinner, Wolfe ordered me to fetch the glass. The glass? I said. The glass, he repeated. From the hall. If it still exists. It did. The hall kept things, the way people keep memories they don't want to examine. The glass was washed, of course, but not perfectly. I brought it back like a relic. Wolfe examined it with a magnifying lens, sniffed it, frowned. Clean, I said. Yes, Wolfe replied. Which is informative. How so? Because someone ensured it would be. Someone had cleaned away more than fingerprints. Someone careful. A slip of the tongue. Late that night, Lena Voss called me. Her voice was strained, like a violin string pulled too tight. I shouldn't have said what I did, she said. You already did, I told her. That's the beauty of words. He was afraid of someone understanding him, she said. He said, they know how I think. Who's they? I don't know. But he changed his routine 3 days ago. My pen stopped. Changed how? He stopped rinsing the glass himself. Said it wasted time. That was contradiction number 3, and it sang. I reported to Wolfe immediately. He listened, nodding slowly. A deviation, Wolfe said. Small. Seemingly insignificant. Yet fatal. You think the killer knew about it, I said. I think, Wolfe replied, the killer caused it. Outside, a taxi splashed through a puddle, horns echoing like distant brass. Inside, the orchid stood in judgment. Wolfe leaned back, satisfied in the way that means trouble is organizing itself. Archie, he said, we are no longer searching for a poisoner. We are searching for a student of Elliot Crane. And when we find him? I asked. Wolfe's eyes hardened. Then we shall listen to his explanation, and determine whether it is in tune with the facts. I went to bed with the smell of orchids in my nose and the rhythm of a piano in my head, certain of only one thing. Someone had played Crane like an instrument, and the performance wasn't over yet. Chapter 4, The Perfect Victim. Nero Wolfe likes victims the way chess players like openings, not because they're helpless, but because they reveal the mind of the opponent. Elliot Crane, Wolfe decided, was a perfect victim, not innocent, not careless, but precisely calibrated to be exploited. Wolfe announced this over breakfast, which Fritz had prepared with the reverence usually reserved for funerals and peace treaties. Wolfe ate with his usual gravity, buttering toast as if it were a legal document. The deceased, Wolfe said, was arrogant. I nodded. He had fans and restraining orders. He was disciplined, Wolfe continued. He was admired, resented, imitated. Above all, he believed himself untouchable. That last part usually comes right before the fall, I said. Indeed. He was perfect because he was predictable. I reached for coffee. Predictable geniuses still get mugged. Not by amateurs, Wolfe said. This was not an amateur. That put a little extra caffeine in my bloodstream. Blackmail and brilliant enemies. Wolfe sent me out again, this time not for habits but for leverage. Find what Crane held, he said. Information is heavier than poison. It didn't take long. When a man rises fast, he steps on hands. When he rises very fast, those hands keep receipts. Julian Krebs coughed one up. I met him again in a diner off 8th Avenue, cracked vinyl booths, waitresses with iron wills, and coffee that tasted like it had seen things. I didn't kill him, Krebs said immediately. Good, I replied. Then you won't mind explaining the letter. His eyes flicked to the envelope I slid across the table. Inside was a copy of a legal notice, never filed, never sent, accusing Crane of plagiarizing a minor theme from an unpublished Krebs manuscript. The thing had teeth. He threatened me with it, Krebs said bitterly. Said if I ever spoke publicly again, he'd bury me. Why didn't he? He enjoyed watching me sweat. Did anyone else know about this? Krebs hesitated. His assistant. And Hale. There was that name again. It was starting to feel like a motif. Next stop, Mrs. Cordelia Rusk's penthouse. She didn't like being questioned twice. She disliked it the way queens dislike rebellion. You are becoming tiresome, she said. Occupational hazard, I told her. Did Crane have financial leverage on you? Her eyes sharpened. He was expensive. That's not what I asked. She crossed the room slowly. He knew my board planned to cut funding. He threatened to announce it, publicly, before my gala. It would have ruined me. Did you give in? Yes. Did you enjoy it? Her silence was answer enough. And Hale? I asked. She sniffed. A parasite. He lived through Elliot. Parasites sometimes poison hosts. The doctor who knew too much. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened, then sent me out again, this time to a discreet physician who specialized in performance-related stress. A man like Crane would have had one. The doctor was nervous, which always makes me nervous. Crane consulted me, he admitted. About heart strain. Anxiety. He was fine physically. Brilliantly fine. Any unusual prescriptions? No. He refused medication. He believed chemistry dulled genius. Did anyone else consult you about him? The doctor's fingers tightened on his desk. Hale. He asked, hypothetical questions. About what? About substances that could mimic collapse under stress. That was more than hypothetical. Wolfe draws a circle. That evening, Wolfe summoned me to the office earlier than usual. He was already in his chair, beer untouched, orchids glowing behind him like pale jurors. Archie, he said, we are dealing with a man who studied Crane as a system. Sounds like Hale, I said. Perhaps, Wolfe replied. But do not be seduced by repetition. Others may qualify. He dictated a list: access, knowledge, motive, opportunity. I filled it in as he spoke. Lena Voss had access and knowledge, but fear, not ambition. Sylvia Merrick had motive and knowledge, but not access. Krebs had motive, but lacked proximity. Mrs. Rusk had access, but insufficient technical understanding. And Hale, I said. Hale, Wolfe said carefully, had knowledge, proximity, history, and resentment. That sounds like a resume. Or a distraction. I frowned. You think someone's framing him? I think someone wishes us to think of him first. The early summons. Then Wolfe did something unusual. He ordered me to summon all principal suspects to the brownstone, immediately. That's early, I said. You usually let them simmer. Simmering, Wolfe said, allows evaporation. I prefer containment. The phone calls were fun in the way dental surgery is fun. Mrs. Rusk protested. Sylvia Merrick demanded to know why. Krebs cursed. Lena Voss went silent. Hale said he would come at once. That last part bothered me. A near mistake. While waiting, I reviewed my notes and nearly committed a crime of my own, arresting the wrong suspect in my head. It fit, too neatly. Hale had motive, knowledge, opportunity. He'd brought a bottle. He'd asked doctors questions. He'd arrived first at Wolfe's door. I told Wolfe my thoughts. He listened, then frowned, not at me, but at the ceiling. You are hasty, he said. I'm efficient. You are impatient, Wolfe said. Efficiency is a consequence of patience, not its replacement. That sounds like something you embroidered on a pillow. Attend, Wolfe snapped. Hale is obvious. The killer is not. That stopped me. The real shift. The suspects arrived one by one, tension trailing them like cigarette smoke. They sat, stood, paced. Wolfe observed silently, like a Buddha with better posture. Sylvia Merrick wouldn't sit. Mrs. Rusk sat too well. Krebs looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Lena Voss stared at the carpet. Hale stood calmly, hands folded. Wolfe spoke at last. Mr. Crane was killed because he was perfect. They looked at him. Confused. Off balance. He was predictable, Wolfe continued. He was disciplined. He trusted systems over people. Sylvia snorted. That killed him. No, Wolfe said. That enabled his killer. He turned his gaze slowly around the room. One of you understood Crane not emotionally, but structurally. You understood when he would deviate, and how to encourage that deviation. Hale shifted. Slightly. Too slightly. Archie, Wolfe said, observe. I did. Hale's eyes flicked, not to Wolfe, but to Lena Voss. Fear. Or calculation. Before I could sort it out, Wolfe dismissed them all. Tomorrow, he said, we will continue. After they left, I exploded. You had them. Someone nearly cracked. Nearly, Wolfe said, is insufficient. You let a killer walk. No, Wolfe replied calmly. I allowed him to believe he has. He leaned back, finally lifting his beer. The perfect victim creates a perfect illusion. Our task is to discover who believed it would remain perfect. Outside, night settled over the brownstone, taxis hissing past like whispers. Inside, the orchids glowed, patient and watchful. And somewhere, someone was realizing they had underestimated Nero Wolfe, an error no prodigy survives twice. Chapter 5, The Poison That Leaves No Fingerprints. By the fifth day of a murder investigation, even New York starts to smell tired. The streets keep moving, the taxis keep honking, but underneath it all there's a faint odor of impatience, like cold coffee left too long on a hot plate. Nero Wolfe was immune to it. He sat in his red leather armchair, enormous and unmoved, as if impatience were something other men caught from unsanitary habits. The orchids behind him glowed with their usual smug health, which meant Wolfe was thinking clearly. That worried me. The poison, Wolfe said, without preamble, was chosen for its absence. Of what? I asked. Evidence. I had just come in from the medical examiner's office again, my coat damp from a late winter drizzle and my mood matching it. They're still hedging, I said. Trace compounds, borderline indicators, nothing they can hang a press release on. Excellent, Wolfe replied. The killer is competent. Lucky us. Wolfe picked up his beer, tasted it, and nodded faintly. A crude poison would have been detected. A dramatic one would have left residue. This substance, he tapped the arm of his chair, passed through Mr. Crane as an idea passes through a foolish mind. Quickly, and without a trace. That's poetic, I said. Also unhelpful. You are incorrect, Wolfe said. It tells us the killer was not improvising. Minute-by-minute death. Wolfe ordered me to reconstruct the recital again, this time not as an observer, but as a participant. Assume you are the murderer, he said. You have access to the glass. You have the poison. When do you act? Before the performance, I said. Plant it and walk away. And risk dilution. Evaporation. Discovery. Wolfe shook his head. No. During intermission, then. Better, Wolfe said. But still imperfect. The victim might not drink. So, after. Precisely, Wolfe said. Immediately before the final piece. When thirst is certain and attention is elsewhere. That narrowed things. Access during intermission, knowledge of Crane's habits, confidence in timing. I groaned. That still leaves half our cast. Half, Wolfe agreed, is progress. A glass half empty. I went back to the hall with a stopwatch and a bad attitude. I timed everything, applause, pauses, stagehands crossing, musicians moving like ants in organized confusion. I learned something small and irritating. During intermission, the backstage corridor narrowed to a choke point. Anyone entering or leaving had to pass a small refreshment table where, on the night of the recital, a single glass of mineral water sat waiting. Not guarded. Not labeled. Just there. I found the usher who had been stationed nearby. Did anyone touch the glass? I asked. He frowned. Plenty of people walked past it. Did anyone stop? He thought. One person adjusted it. Moved it closer to the piano bench. Who? A man. Older. Confident. Like he belonged. That could have been half the city, but the confidence mattered. A frame begins to show. That night, Wolfe called me into the office before dinner, which is always a sign of impending irritation. Archie, he said, someone is attempting to redirect us. Join the club. Evidence has appeared, Wolfe continued, that is too convenient. He slid a paper across the desk. It was a statement from Julian Krebs, fresh, emotional, and full of confession-adjacent language. He claimed Crane had threatened him again recently. Claimed he'd been near the hall. Claimed a lot. Looks like he's cracking, I said. Or being pressed, Wolfe said. Observe the language. It is defensive, not remorseful. I read it again. Wolfe was right. Krebs was explaining himself to someone, not confessing. You think he's being framed? I think, Wolfe said, someone wants us to believe the murder was committed by rage. Rage is noisy. This murder was silent. That made me uneasy. The killer's mistake. Late that night, Lena Voss showed up unannounced. Fritz glared at her as if she had personally disrupted the soup. I didn't do it, she said before I could speak. That's becoming popular, I replied. She was shaking, not theatrically, but like a woman whose routines had been ripped apart. Someone went through my files, she said. Crane's schedules. Notes. Personal habits. When? After his death. That was interesting. A killer confident enough to return to the scene of control. Did they take anything? No. They copied things. That was the mistake. I related to Wolfe. He closed his eyes briefly, like a man enjoying a private joke. The murderer, he said, is anxious. Doesn't sound like a killer who planned everything. On the contrary, Wolfe replied. It sounds like one who planned too well, and now fears exposure. A wrong turn. I nearly blew it the next day. Sylvia Marek's alibi developed a hole, one of her supposed witnesses recanted under pressure. She had motive, knowledge, and now shaky timing. I brought it to Wolfe, triumphant. She could have done it, I said. She knew performance stress. She was backstage. She hated him. Wolfe looked at me for a long moment, then spoke softly. Archie, you are succumbing to narrative. What's wrong with that? It is seductive, Wolfe said. And false. He leaned forward. Miss Merrick hated Crane. Hatred is loud. Her anger would have demanded recognition. This murder sought invisibility. That stopped me cold. So I'm chasing noise. Yes, Wolfe said. While the music plays elsewhere. The poison explained, almost. That evening, Wolfe finally explained the poison, not its name, but its nature. It accelerates, he said. It encourages the body to overreact to its own signals. Stress becomes collapse. Effort becomes failure. Like pushing a runner downhill, I said. He doesn't trip, he just can't stop. An apt metaphor, Wolfe said. And one requiring knowledge. Medical? Partly. Musical understanding helped. Knowing when the body would be most vulnerable. I thought of Hale. Of Rusk. Of Voss. Of anyone who had watched Crane closely enough to know his limits. Whoever did this, I said, understood Crane better than he understood himself. Wolfe nodded. That is why it worked. Night calls. The phone rang at midnight. I answered, already tired. A quiet voice. Male. Careful. You're close, the voice said. Too close. Who is this? I demanded. A pause. Then, stop before someone else gets hurt. The line went dead. I stared at the receiver, then at Wolfe. That, Wolfe said calmly, was unwise of him. You know who it was? I know what it was, Wolfe replied. A test. A test of what? Of our confidence. He stood, slowly, with effort, and moved to the window, looking out at the dark street where taxis slid past like yellow thoughts. Archie, he said, the poison left no fingerprints. But the killer is leaving something else. What? Fear. I swallowed. That's not admissible in court. No, Wolfe agreed. But it is invaluable in deduction. He returned to his chair, settled into it like a general preparing a final maneuver. Tomorrow, he said, the murderer will attempt one final adjustment, to the truth. And us? Wolfe's eyes hardened. We will be ready. I went to bed with the phone call echoing in my head, the rhythm of the recital ticking like a clock, and the uncomfortable certainty that we were no longer simply investigating a death. We were being watched, and the watcher was running out of time. Chapter 6, A False Genius Exposed. If you ever want to see how fast a theory can outrun its legs, give it a little encouragement and a badge. By mid-morning the city had decided it wanted a villain it could pronounce easily, and Julian Krebs fit the mouth like a bad tooth. His statement had, confession, written between the lines if you squinted, and his alibi had thinned the way cheap soup thins when you add water. Inspector Kramer called me from a pay phone that sounded like it had been punched recently. We've got Krebs, he said. He's sweating. Says things he shouldn't say. That's his hobby, I said. Doesn't make him a killer. You Wolfe men always say that, Kramer growled. Until you don't. I hung up and went upstairs, where Nero Wolfe sat in his red leather armchair, a monument to the idea that panic is optional. The orchids behind him were luminous and smug. Fritz clinked in the kitchen, the sound of civilized life continuing in defiance of homicide. They're going to arrest Krebs, I said. Wolfe's eyes closed briefly. Not tired, annoyed. They are precipitate. That's a fancy way of saying stupid. It is also a chemical term, Wolfe said. Inappropriate, here. You think it's a frame. I think, Wolfe said, opening his eyes, that Krebs is a decoy with an unfortunate personality. He waved a hand. Sit. I sat. When Wolfe tells you to sit, you sit. It's less about authority than physics. Archie, he said, the murderer is intelligent. He would not permit his crime to be solved by a clerk with a grievance. Then why push Krebs into the spotlight? To buy time, Wolfe said. And to test us. That word again. Test. It was starting to itch. The arrest that shouldn't be. They took Krebs that afternoon. I went down to the precinct out of professional masochism and watched him protest with a voice that had practiced indignation but not fear. I didn't do it, he snapped when he saw me. You know that. I know you didn't do it the way they think you did, I said. Which is not comforting. He laughed, a brittle sound. Someone's setting me up. Yes, I said. And you're cooperating. Kramer pulled me aside. We've got motive, access, opportunity. You've got noise, I said. This murder was quiet. Wolfe, fill your head with that. Kramer said. We've got a witness puts Krebs near the glass. Which witness? Kramer named him. An usher. The same one who'd seen an older, confident man adjust the glass. That usher, I said slowly, has changed his story. Kramer bristled. People remember things. People remember things when they're reminded, I said. Or paid. Kramer stared at me. Then he turned away. That was his version of listening. I went back to the brownstone feeling like I just watched a man hammer the wrong nail because it was handy. Wolfe loses his temper. Wolfe doesn't shout. He doesn't pace. He doesn't threaten. When he's angry, he becomes surgical. He listened to my report, his face turning grave in a way that meant someone was about to lose an illusion. This is intolerable, he said. The killer is exploiting incompetence. That's also common, I said. Wolfe's eyes snapped to me. Archie, if Mr. Krebs is convicted, the murderer will have succeeded twice. Once for killing Crane, I said. What's the second? For killing Truth, Wolfe said. I will not permit it. He reached for the phone with decisive slowness and made a call that lasted precisely long enough to be unpleasant for the recipient. When he hung up, he said, Inspector Kramer will delay. Because you asked nicely? Because I was persuasive, Wolfe said. And correct. He sat back, breathing carefully, the way a man does when he has restrained himself from rearranging the furniture. The trait everyone misread. Now, Wolfe said, we will correct an error. Which one? I asked. We've got a catalog. The assumption, Wolfe said, that Elliot Crane was careless. He deviated, I said. He stopped rinsing the glass. That is not carelessness, Wolfe said. It is economy. I frowned. You're saying he wasn't sloppy, he was efficient. Precisely, Wolfe said. Crane did not abandon his discipline. He refined it. He leaned forward. The killer believed Crane could be manipulated into negligence. That belief is false. So the poison couldn't rely on Crane being careless, I said. It had to rely on something else. Trust, Wolfe said. Specifically, Crane's trust in systems over people. That landed with a thud. Meaning? I asked. Meaning, Wolfe said, the killer did not depend on Crane forgetting to rinse the glass. He ensured the glass was prepared within the system Crane trusted. I thought of schedules. Of backstage routines. Of assistants and patrons and mentors who moved within the machinery of Crane's life without friction. Someone who belonged, I said. Someone who was invisible because he was appropriate, Wolfe said. The wrong genius. That evening, Sylvia Merrick showed up unannounced, anger trailing her like perfume. They arrested Krebs, she said. You let that happen. I don't let the police do anything, I said. They have hobbies. You know he didn't do it, she snapped. Yes. She folded her arms. Then who did? I glanced at Wolfe. He regarded her coolly. Miss Merrick, he said, you admired Mr. Crane. She stiffened. He was brilliant. You resented him, Wolfe continued. Yes. Yet you would not have killed him, Wolfe said. Do you know why? She hesitated. Because, Wolfe said, you wished to defeat him. Sylvia's eyes widened slightly. Wolfe continued, inexorable. Defeat requires recognition. Murder annihilates recognition. It is an admission of inferiority. Sylvia's mouth opened, then closed. She stood very still. You're saying the killer didn't see himself as inferior, she said quietly. On the contrary, Wolfe said. He saw himself as equal, or superior. She left without another word. Her footsteps on the stairs sounded like punctuation. The shift. After she was gone, Wolfe turned to me. The killer, he said, is not driven by envy. Then by what? I asked. By comprehension, Wolfe said. He understood Crane not as a rival, but as a construct. I thought of Martin Hale's calm. Of Mrs. Rusk's management. Of Lena Voss's systems. Of the doctor's hypotheticals. Someone who taught him, I said. Or owned him, Wolfe said. Or maintained him. He steepled his fingers. The murderer misunderstood one trait. He believed Crane could be coerced into vulnerability. In fact, Crane embraced vulnerability, on his own terms. So the killer had to adjust, I said. Yes, Wolfe said. And that adjustment left a trace. Not chemical, I said. Behavioral, Wolfe replied. A crack appears. Late that night, the phone rang. I answered. A voice I recognized immediately, controlled, polite, precise. You are making errors, Martin Hale said. I closed my eyes. You called me at midnight to critique. I called to prevent injustice, Hale said. Krebs is innocent. That makes two of us, I said. Why do you care? A pause. Then, because Elliot deserved better. He's dead, I said. Deserving's out of his hands. Another pause. Longer this time. You are close, Hale said. But you are listening to the wrong music. I smiled thinly. Funny. That's what the killer said last night. The line went dead. I carried the receiver into the office and told Wolfe everything. He listened, nodding once. There, Wolfe said softly, is the crack. Because he called? I asked. Because he spoke of deserving, Wolfe said. The murderer believes his act was corrective. That's sick, I said. It is logical, Wolfe replied. And logic is vulnerable. He leaned back, enormous and serene, like a man who had finally placed the last piece of a puzzle, but had not yet allowed himself the pleasure of seeing the picture. Archie, he said, prepare yourself. For what? For the final movement, Wolfe said. The killer is about to make his last mistake. Outside, the city breathed and muttered and moved on. Inside, the orchids watched. And somewhere in New York, a man who believed he had improved the world by removing a prodigy was discovering that Nero Wolfe had begun to understand him, not as a criminal, but as a composer. Which is far more dangerous. Chapter 7, Nero Wolfe conducts his orchestra. If you've never seen Nero Wolfe prepare a confrontation, imagine a general arranging chairs instead of troops. The movements are minimal, the purpose absolute, and the casualties, when they come, are permanent. By mid-afternoon, the brownstone smelled of orchids, polished wood, and inevitability. Wolfe had insisted on a full house. Not because he needed everyone, but because the killer did. They must hear it, Wolfe said, directing me to place chairs with the fussiness of a man aligning planets. The explanation loses force in fragments. Nothing like a captive audience, I said. Should I sell programs? Wolfe ignored me, which meant he was satisfied. Inspector Kramer arrived first, scowling like a man who suspected he'd been invited to his own embarrassment. Then Mrs. Cordelia Rusk swept in, dignity wrapped around her like armor. Sylvia Merrick followed, tense, alert, eyes sharp. Lena Voss came quietly, carrying her fear with professional restraint. Julian Krebs was escorted by a uniform, pale and furious. And finally, precisely on time, Martin Hale. Hale nodded to Wolfe with the calm of a man who believed he belonged in the room. That was his first mistake. Wolfe waited until everyone was seated or standing where he wanted them. He remained in his red leather armchair, monumental and unmoving, the conductor before the downbeat. Ladies and gentlemen, Wolfe began, you are here because Elliot Crane is dead, and because one of you understands why. There was a ripple of tension. Kramer folded his arms. Hale's expression remained politely attentive. This murder, Wolfe continued, was not an act of passion. It was a composition. I leaned against the desk, notebook open, eyes moving from face to face. This was my favorite part, the moment when people realize they're no longer watching the show. They're in it. The opening theme. Mr. Crane, Wolfe said, was a prodigy. He was also a system. His life ran on routines, schedules, and disciplines of his own making. Sylvia snorted softly. Mrs. Rusk stiffened. He trusted systems over people, Wolfe went on. Therefore, the murderer did not approach him as a man, but as a mechanism. Hale shifted his weight. Just slightly. The poison, Wolfe said, was chosen not for lethality, but for subtlety. It accelerated the body's own responses. Effort became collapse. Applause became silence. Krebs blurted, you said it wasn't me. It was not, Wolfe said curtly. Be quiet. Kramer raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Tempo. The timing, Wolfe said, was precise. The substance had to be administered during intermission, yet take effect only after the final piece. This required confidence, certainty, that Mr. Crane would drink. Lena Voss swallowed. He always did. Indeed, Wolfe said. Because he trusted the process that placed the glass. He turned his gaze to Mrs. Rusk. Your staff arranged flowers backstage. Yes, she said coolly. As always. And the glass was placed near the piano, Wolfe continued. Adjusted closer. The usher's testimony hovered in the air like a held note. The instrument. The poison left no fingerprints, Wolfe said. Because it was never meant to be discovered. The killer relied on misdirection, on the assumption that rage or jealousy would be blamed. He looked at Krebs, then at Sylvia Merrick. Mr. Krebs' bitterness was exploited. Miss Marrick's ambition was misread. Sylvia stiffened. Misread how? You wish to defeat Crane, Wolfe said. Not erase him. Murder would have admitted his superiority. Sylvia's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The conductor. Wolfe's voice lowered. The room leaned in without realizing it. The murderer, Wolfe said, understood Mr. Crane intimately, not emotionally, but structurally. He knew when Crane would deviate, and why. I felt it then, the subtle tightening in the room. Eyes flicked. Breath slowed. 3 days before the recital, Wolfe continued, Mr. Crane altered a habit. He ceased rinsing his glass personally. This was not negligence. It was efficiency, encouraged by someone who understood the system well enough to modify it. Hale's fingers curled and uncurled once. Who, Wolfe asked softly, would know Crane's habits well enough to suggest such an adjustment? Silence. Who, Wolfe continued, would possess sufficient musical understanding to predict the physiological stress of performance, and sufficient medical curiosity to inquire about substances that mimic collapse? Kramer's eyes shifted to Hale. Slowly. The break. Hale smiled thinly. This is elegant rhetoric, Mr. Wolfe. But elegance is not evidence. No, Wolfe agreed. But it is preparation. He turned to me. Archie. I stood straight. The phone call, I said. The anonymous warning. The voice belonged to someone who believed the murder was corrective, not criminal. Hale's smile faded. The caller spoke of deserving, Wolfe said. Of justice. Of improvement. That could mean anyone, Hale said evenly. On the contrary, Wolfe said. It means only one kind of person. He leaned forward, immense and inescapable. One who believes genius must be controlled. The word hung there, controlled. Mrs. Rusk inhaled sharply. Lena Voss stared at Hale. Sylvia's eyes narrowed. You taught him, Wolfe said. You shaped his discipline. When he outgrew you, you did not envy him, you corrected him. That's absurd, Hale snapped. The first crack of emotion. I loved Elliot. Yes, Wolfe said calmly. And you could not permit him to become reckless with his own greatness. Hale laughed, a brittle, sudden sound. You think I killed him to protect art? I think, Wolfe said, you killed him to preserve a system you no longer commanded. The confession that wasn't. Hale straightened his jacket. You have no proof. Not of guilt, Wolfe agreed. But of understanding. He gestured slightly. Kramer stepped forward, attention sharp. You brought a restorative bottle to Crane, Wolfe said. You asked hypothetical questions of physicians. You adjusted backstage routines without drawing notice. And you called Archie, twice. Hale's eyes flicked to me, then away. That is imprudent, Wolfe said. A conductor does not step into the audience. Hale exhaled slowly. You're very good, Mr. Wolfe. That was it. Not a confession. Not denial. Just acknowledgement. Kramer moved closer. Martin Hale, you're under arrest. Hale did not resist. He only looked at Wolfe. I improved him, Hale said quietly. I made him perfect. Wolfe's voice was cold. You mistook perfection for obedience. Hale was taken away, his footsteps echoing down the stairs like the last fading note of a concert gone wrong. Aftermath. The others left in silence, shaken, thoughtful, or furious. Krebs was released. Sylvia avoided my eyes. Mrs. Rusk swept out without a word. Lena Voss lingered only long enough to whisper, thank you. When the door finally closed, the brownstone breathed again. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, exhausted now that the work was done. You almost said it all, I told him. Almost, Wolfe replied. The final movement requires reflection. I nodded, glancing at the orchids glowing softly behind him. Tomorrow, I said. Yes, Wolfe agreed. Tomorrow. Outside, the city resumed its noise, unaware that a symphony had ended, and that the last note had not yet been played. Chapter 8, The Final Silence. The trouble with finales is that they're quieter than you expect. After all the build-up, the truth doesn't explode, it settles. Like dust. Like a note held too long and then released. The morning after Martin Hale was taken away, the brownstone woke as if nothing had happened. Fritz clattered in the kitchen, offended at the idea that murder might disrupt a proper breakfast. The orchids stood in their ranks, pale and superior. Nero Wolfe sat in his red leather armchair, enormous, serene, and finished. I brought him his beer at precisely the wrong time. Archie, he said, without looking at me, you are early. Habit, I said. I learned it from a dead prodigy. Wolfe accepted the glass anyway. He studied the foam, then took a careful sip. The conclusion, he said, is complete. That's funny, I replied. Because my head still feels like it's waiting for the symbols. Wolfe glanced at me. Then you have not listened to the coda. The why that matters. I sat opposite him, notebook closed for once. You knew it was Hale before yesterday. I knew, Wolfe said, that the killer believed himself necessary. That's not evidence. No, Wolfe agreed. It is motive. He set the glass down. Hale did not envy Crane. He did not hate him. He regarded him as a project. That's worse, I said. Yes, Wolfe replied. Because projects do not bleed. He explained it, not as an accusation, but as anatomy. Hale had shaped Crane from adolescence. Taught him discipline. Timing. Control. When Crane outgrew him, when independence replaced obedience, Hale did not feel loss. He felt system failure. So he corrected it, I said. Precisely, Wolfe said. He did not seek to destroy genius. He sought to preserve it in a static state. By killing it. By preventing deviation, Wolfe corrected. In his mind, the act was preservative. That was the part that stuck with me. Murder as maintenance. The method revisited. For the record, I said, walk me through it. Cleanly. Wolfe inclined his head. Hale knew Crane's routines intimately. He encouraged the minor efficiency, ceasing the glass rinse, under the guise of professionalism. He ensured backstage placement of the glass within the trusted system. During intermission, he administered a substance, undetectable in trace, effective only under stress. And the timing. Calculated, Wolfe said. He anticipated the altered program because Crane always extended performances when confident. Hale knew that, because he had taught him. I grimaced. That's intimate. Yes, Wolfe said. And fatal. The phone calls? I asked. A mistake, Wolfe said. Confidence curdling into anxiety. He wished to control the narrative as he controlled the student. And framing Krebs. Convenient, Wolfe said. Hatred is easy to borrow. Justice, Wolfe style. Inspector Kramer arrived just before noon, looking like a man who had slept poorly but eaten well. You were right, he said to Wolfe, grudgingly. Hale talked. Not a confession. But enough. Wolfe nodded once. That will suffice. Kramer eyed me. You coming down later? Only if there's coffee and no applause, I said. After Kramer left, Wolfe rose with effort and went to the window. The city was gray, busy, indifferent. Somewhere, a radio played music, something light, something forgettable. Elliot Crane will be remembered, I said. Yes, Wolfe replied. As a tragedy. And Hale? As an explanation, Wolfe said. Which is worse? The last reflection. That evening, I stopped by a diner on the way back, one of those places where the booths are cracked and the coffee has opinions. The waitress recognized me. They catch the guy? She asked. They caught a guy, I said. That's something. It is, and it isn't. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was back in his chair, orchids glowing softly behind him like a jury that had reached its verdict. Fritz served dinner with quiet satisfaction. Wolfe ate slowly, thoughtfully. Archie, he said at last, genius is a liability. Tell that to the geniuses, I said. They seldom listen, Wolfe replied. Which is fortunate. I watched him, this enormous man who never left his house yet understood the world with brutal clarity. He did not mourn Crane. He did not celebrate Hale's fall. He simply placed the truth where it belonged and returned to his routines. That's the thing about Nero Wolfe. He doesn't need closure. He needs order. The final silence. Later, as I climbed the stairs to my room, the radio downstairs caught a classical station. A piano piece drifted up, delicate, precise, undeniably beautiful. I paused, listening. Elliot Crane would never play again. Martin Hale would never teach again. The city would keep moving. The orchids would bloom. Wolfe would drink his beer. The music ended. Silence followed, not empty, but complete. That was the final note, and for once, in a city that never shuts up, it felt exactly right.